Fantastic. I think that's people in now. So, oh, there's one more. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 10th annual Scottish Episcopal Institute lecture. How exciting. We are honoured today to have Dr. Daniel, who's going to do our lecture today, with quite an enticing name, Scottish Theology and Scotland, but not Scotland, Scot-Land. Dr. Daniel is a lecturer in St Andrews and has been since 2022, and before was in England, poor thing, in University of Oxford as the MacDonald lecturer. So we're delighted that you can be with us today. Thank you, Dafydd. Just before we start, I just wanted to give a brief introduction to SEI for anyone who doesn't know. We do the ministry for the whole of the Scottish Episcopal Church. So all the way from IME1, which is for ordinands, to curacies, and to continuing ministry training, and of course for lay people too. We have lots of MAs that we offer, so if you're interested in studying with us, please do head to our website or email myself. My name's Dr. Victoria Turner. I'm the Director of Studies here at STI, or Alana Hathaway, who is our very capable academic administrator. Please do drop us an email, and we have lots of courses too that are ready for auditing, so people to come and join. And again, these two are on our website. Also look out for our other offerings. So in Advent, we're going to have an Advent series with Dr. Swarup Bar, who's from Bishop's College in Calcutta from India, who's recorded those for us too. So please keep an eye out, and we look forward to sharing those with you soon. But today, our 10th annual lecturer, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Dafydd Daniel, and the floor is over to you. So the way this is going to work is Dafydd will share his presentation for about 50 minutes, and then the chat is open for questions. If you feel called as he's talking, you can pop them in the chat, and it'll just come to me or Alana, and we'll collect your questions and have space for them at the end. Great. So thank you, Dafydd. Over to you. I'm really looking forward to hearing your lecture.
Let's go. Oh, good. Well, I hope you feel that way at the end still. So thanks very much for inviting me on to give the lecture. It's a great honor and a great opportunity to talk about some research that I'm involved in on Scot-Land. Yes, this inspired hyphen in the middle of Scotland. I was very proud of that, which is why I think I got a research grant to look at these things. Also, just to say that I took all the photographs in the talk, so they're not sort of accidentally non-Scotland images. They are genuinely Scotland in there. So, yeah, Scottish theology in Scotland. I'm going to talk more about the Scottish theology part of it as I go through, and looking there at particularly 18th century Scottish theological debates. But just to begin with more on this broader sense of the context for what I'm going to be talking about, which is really Scotlandlessness. So the project that I'm running is called Owning Scotland, with land ownership and Scottish identity. And it's a project that involves Scottish Land Commission, NHS Scotland, and various academics from around the country working in sort of geography and sustainability, theology, philosophy, history, education, all sorts of different areas. And the idea is to explore some of these three questions that I've put on the slide here, and not least in response to the situation that's mentioned in this quotation. Now, I've just picked this quotation from sort of 10 years ago, but you can pick anything you want from, the current debates on land reform going on at the moment, or go back to Donald Dewar and any moment you want in the history of devolved or undevolved Scottish politics, and you'll see a comment on this, that Scotland is, and it's always referred to this as sort of uniquely in the Western world, really, this concentrated ownership. And in fact, it's even more concentrated now than it was 10 years ago, because there's even fewer these owning these landowners. And it's this, it's some of the rhetoric and language that I'm really interested in, and that's what I'll talk about today. And I'll try and come back to this quotation by the end, as long as I give myself enough time. But you see this idea, so concentrated ownership, 50% of land, only around 400 people. And this idea it's a measure of inequality. It's unequal, and in a modern democracy, it's exceptional and so on, and needs explanation. So as I say, this sort of broad group of people on the project I'm running are looking at this concentrated ownership. How has it arisen? From each of our different disciplines, do we have different answers to this question? Clearances are often mentioned here. Also, why is it a problem? raft of different things. I'll come back to some of them later on, maybe that are often talked about associated with concentrated ownership. And also this point about whether these proposed solutions to it are themselves actually problem-free, whether they actually cause different problems of their own. And again, I might be able to talk about some of that in a moment. There's also another question, though, which we're looking at, and this is sort of what I want to try and draw out today, which is whether it's how land is used that is the real problem, not who owns it. So, I mean, is ownership a distraction? That's often the response to this focused on the concentrated ownership of Scotland. That really it's how it's used that's the main problem, and that doesn't have to just be a problem with use associated with concentrated ownership. So that's often the response, to which the response to that response is, well, how is inseparable from who? That there's something that is necessarily disordering, systemically problematic about concentrated ownership that causes these problems, which is what I'm going to talk about a lot in a little while. Then the issue, though, it seems, I think there's another counter, is that, well, it's the inseparability of how and who aren't consistently maintained in historic discussions of land ownership, but also contemporary discussions of land ownership. That, I mean, you take the land policy at the moment. There's this a test if a community can buy out land that's being owned in a particular way or not used in a certain way, and it's whether it's sustainable development. And so if sustainable development is really the sort of key consideration here, then presumably if we have concentrated ownership, but it is doing rewilding, that was a complaint made on the news this morning by sort of SNP that concentrated these individual landowners aren't doing enough rewilding. Well, if they can be convinced to do that, does that mean that concentrated ownership is not a problem? Because that seems to be a use issue rather than a who owns it issue. So that's the question I want to sort of raise. Where there's a certain lack of clarity on a lot of the terminology, language, the discourse in itself, and it's this the how that mixture happens, or the sort of a sort of inconsistency I'm going to suggest, is because it's this difficult to keep apart question or language about whether we're talking about the value and purpose of land itself or the value and purpose of owning land and the different models of ownership. So this is why I'm going to argue today that there is in the 18th century in particular, Scottish Enlightenment, philosophy, theology, a sort of competition between agental and resource focuses on land, whether land is about agency, vocational, something about duty, there's something special about owning land in some way, that it gives something, it's part of your identity or something like that. Or is it land as a resource? Is that really why land is important? Is owning land, or you having land, whatever, is it because it's economic? It's a financial benefit, that the interest in it is not intrinsic to land itself. It's just the consequences, the use that land can be put to, and that we seem to muddle those two different discourses often, those two discourses. And so the claim I'm going to make today is that muddling or mixing happens, at least in the same way that it did in the 18th century. That the Scottish Enlightenment might not be able to solve the lack of clarity, but it certainly helps to show why that lack of clarity remains in the way that the land debates come through. And what I'm really going to try and argue, which is, depending if you're interested in intellectual history or whatever, but there's sort of more sort of controversial part of it, I suppose, is that it's the Orthodox Calvinists, so the famously conservative Calvinists, the enemies of the Enlightenment, as they were styled at the time and since, that are classical Republicans, what I'm going to call classical Republican, and that it's the moderate members of the church, the literati, the famous Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, that they are interested in a sort of commercial Republican approach towards land, which is less liberal, less liberal in a difficult sense, which I'll clarify now. So I'm going to talk about these two different models. So think about Scottish Enlightenment. And I'm going to argue that I'm going to focus on Scottish Land Commission. The Scottish Land Commission was set up by the Scottish government to look into concentrated land ownership in particular. And later on in the talk, I'm going to draw out some of their language, so some from their documents. And I'm going to argue that their documents show a mixture of Orthodox Calvinist classical Republican and moderate literati commercial Republican language. They mix them together. So in doing that, then I have to sort of highlight what we mean by these two parties of the church, these two ways of speaking about land. So a thing to remember about the Scottish Enlightenment is that it is actually a battle between two factions within the Scottish Kirk, within the Presbyterian Church. This is what it is. And we talk the Enlightenment, Age of Reason, all this sort of stuff, secularization. Well, the Age of Reason really doesn't work so much in Scottish Enlightenment because the Enlightenment literati are, as I mentioned in a moment, sentimentalists. They oppose reason as a adequate force, and it's the Orthodox Calvinists that become the defenders of reason. So in Scottish context, the Age of Reason people are actually the anti-Enlightenment people, and so on. But yeah, you've got this battle between these two factions of the church. So the moderate party, they're the famous, people you can think of. David Hume describes them as his friends, right? Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, Hugh Blair, the famous Enlightenment philosophers, theologians. They are important to remember. They are all often themselves clergymen, if not active supporters of the church. They're members of the moderate part, what's called the moderate party of the Scottish Church, and they're opposed by these Orthodox Calvinists. Now, the Orthodox Calvinists are called the popular party because they support the popular election of ministers. So what starts to happen in early 18th century Scotland is that the Patronage Act is passed, and this means that the patron, the local landowner, gets to choose who the vicar is. And this, of course, is a scandal in Presbyterian and Congregationalist circles. And what we now call the moderate versus the Orthodox popular party emerges through these controversies, right? Through the controversy over patronage. That it's the Conservatives are the supporters of the popular vote. So already you might start to see how what we tend to think of as conservative traditionalism match onto that language. And I mean, I can't go into that here in great detail, but you have to take my word for it that this debate over patronage is at the centre of every single sort of debate in the 18th century Scotland. I mean, philosophy, theology, who's going to be a university professor, Hume and Cambridge were tend to be excommunicated, the Douglas affair, which is about the performing a theatre, having a theatre stage was illegal in Scotland at the time due to sort of these Calvinist laws or Orthodox Calvinist laws, but the moderate literati put on this play Douglas, which was a celebration of the early Scottish merchant. In the audience, someone shouts, "Where's your Willie Shakespeare now?" That's the sort of thing. So it's this emergence of Scotland having its own sort of not just its own philosophy, the Athens of the North, of course, but also its own literature, written by a clergyman called John Hume as well. But yeah, succession, right? The succeeders. I'll mention more of them in a moment. The Erskines. That comes out of this controversy over patronage. And what starts to happen then is they got this again popular versus moderate, Orthodox versus literati, and what the popular party do in all of these controversies. In the Keevan case, by the way, is where a clergyman gets removed, Andrew Gillespie, for not being appointed by the local landlord, Captain Anne Struther, the patron of that parish in Inverkeithing. So what they start having is that the popular Orthodox Calvinists start to cast the moderate wing of the church as a dictatorial club of gentlemen, right? They're sort of aristocratic. They are domineering. All of these are quotes from John Witherspoon. I mentioned a moment his famous satire of the Orthodox of the times in the early 1750s, and that it's the Orthodox that are on the side of the common people, right? For rustic souls, all of this language comes into it, and what they do, it seems to me, is that they express. This is a sort of missed thing, really, not least because a lot of these figures aren't widely studied, right? Everyone looks at the famous Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, not these. I mean, every sort of biography you read of Hume, right? These are the sort of backward-looking, traditional conservative. They hate the theatre. They try and excommunicate a philosopher, right? These are clearly not enlightened individuals. But when you read them, of course, they view themselves as more enlightened than the moderates. They are anti-aristocratic. They're pro-common people, and they are in favour of both, as I'll say in a moment, Calvin, Cicero, and Isaac Newton against the literati. So it really is a sort of battle between these two parties in the church, who's genuinely enlightened. And the Orthodox put this forward in what we call classical Republican concerns. So I'm going to define that a little bit and try and get through all of these slides. So what do I mean by classical Republicanism? I could spend the whole talk just talking about this, so I'll try not to do that. But it's often called Greek republicanism. Machiavelli and others are taken up into this. Livy, Aristotle. It's a long tradition, long tradition. The key thing and it's like everything in philosophy, theology, right? It's heavily contested, right? Some people deny there's such a thing as classical Republicans, who is in there and who's not stuff. So you can debate it endlessly. But the main sort of strands that come through of what we mean when we say classical Republican is this idea of freedom and therefore politics itself being that of non-domination. So this is the key word, non-domination. Now, non-domination, what the classical Republicans are getting at, and then later on trying to revive, is that what happens through the liberal tradition, Locke, Hobbes, and lots of other figures, even Bentham, so you can see how different each of they are, very different philosophies, all part of this liberal tradition. And why I call that liberal is because they have the same definition of freedom. What is it to be free is not to be restrained. Right, so your will is not interfered with. You have certain choices that you wish to make, and you can just make them. Now, what the Republican tradition is completely opposed to that definition of freedom. That a sort of freedom where you're just absolutely, completely arbitrary freedom is not real freedom because it encourages you actually to start to enslaving yourself to your passions and sensibilities. So what the point here is that law can doesn't, even though it restrains your will, doesn't dominate you. Right, it's actually freeing something that's often called compatibilism because there's something compatible between law and freedom and so on. So again, and this word that Luther has, antinomian, lawlessness. So the Republicans don't like lawlessness. It's not that you can't just be lawless. That's associated with liberalism in its broad sense that your will is just restrained to anything you want. Also, then, so it's not that it's not legalism either. Right, so there is a law. It's the law of reason, duty, deontology. Why does that law not dominate you? Because it is your law. So the idea is something about the difference between an arbitrary extrinsic law placed upon you by someone else is horrific to the classical Republicans. But that's not the same thing as saying that you follow your own reason, because that's an intrinsic law. So objective moral duty is something that frees you because you're a rational agent. So here, remember what the word passion means, right? Passion, passivity. You're taken over by your emotions, by your feelings, that sort of thing, not by a law which you can then guide and measure your own actions according to. That's what's going on here. So it's not about it's yours. Now, what that means to classical Republicans is there's an analogy between a correctly governed individual and a correctly governed state. That a correctly governed individual has stoic self-command, right? They are in control of themselves. They're following a law. It's their law and it guides them. So it's interesting. And so that's the same model then for a state. That a state also follows the law of reason. So you can see how sort of why natural law might come into this and so on. So there's the polis, right? That sort of political city-state is not going to have a different law from the one you'd follow as an individual. It's the same law, and following that law as an individual means that you develop the virtues, private virtues, personal virtues, command, self-command, control, right? Good citizen, good parent, right? All those goods, those traditional goods, are the virtues. And if your city, your state follows those same laws, then it has public virtue, civic virtue, right? It's civilized in that sort of sense. So that's the idea. What that also means then, crucially then, is that there is special status given to land ownership in the classical Republican tradition of families, individuals owning their own land, because that is a guarantor of your freedom, your independence. You cannot be dominated by your society, by the king, by anything else, if you own your own land. So land is essential to resist domination. And also, I mean, Vivian Brown puts it really nicely then with these figure dichotomies, for the absolute dichotomies, right? Passion, appetite, right? I've mentioned versus reason and law. Reason, law, agency, all of those things come together, and they're opposed to passion, private interest, despotism, and so on. So there's complete oppositions. And where you see that comes out, say, Algernon Sidney, great classical Republican politician, 17th century. You see this point about he is a slave who serves the best and gentlest man in the world, as well as he who serves the worst. Now, why this is important, and again, I'm not going to just drop this and come back to some of it as I go through. You can see that why this is different from a broad sense of a liberal tradition of the will, because here you should be able to, if freedom is just non-restraint, you can make your own choices, right? You can have a transactional basis of your life, and you can choose to do any work that you want for money, because that's what you've chosen to do. for example. Whereas here, the fact is that you're still being enslaved. If someone else is dominating you, is telling you what to do, and it goes against what your real interests are, if you're doing it just because you want to indulge yourself to get money and finance and so on, then that's a problem. Because not only are you being dominated by someone else, you're also being dominated by an irrational end. Right? It's not the idea of duty and goods and virtue. It's transactional, personal consumption and this sort of thing. So there's these great oppositions that come through. So that's an outline of classical republicanism. Now, where I'm interested in this classical republicanism is it does seem to me to come in really interesting ways. I mean, these Orthodox Calvinists are self-consciously styling themselves as classical Republicans in the language that they use. They talk, I'll mention this in a moment if I have a chance, but they talk about the Scotland in its last days, right? It's like the fall of Rome and everything else with the moderate literati, these awful sort of moderates that are around, that they're sort of distorting and sort of leading to vice within Scottish society in the same way happened to the last days of Greece and Rome. So they are definitely talking classical Republican terms. What's interesting is it does map, you can see why they are, because it maps onto, it seems to me anyway, that's my claim, maps onto some interesting Calvinist claims about language. And they start to develop, they're developing here, my argument is a sort of Calvinist theology of ownership in the 18th century, particularly in the middle of the 18th century. So what are some of the overlaps then with classical republicanism as I defined it and with Calvinism? Now, one thing here is, and a lot of you on this talk no doubt know more about this than I do, so I'm not going to introduce all this, but Jubilee. So Leviticus 25, this idea of Jubilee, that every 50 years the land has to return to its original owners, that you can sell land and you can profit from land and everything else, but then the land is going to revert back to the families that originally owned it after that 50-year point. So everything resets. So a really interesting sort of idea of preventing monopolizing of land, right, and sort of breaking apart the ideas to prevent great apportionment and so on. But that's Leviticus 25. And Calvin's commentaries on this, this is I'll get to Calvin's commentary in a moment, but Calvin's commentary becomes really significant for these figures in the 18th century. They cite it an awful lot, and you can see here why they come. The land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. So something about the fact then that in the classical Republican tradition, owning land is significant because it's the absolute guarantee of your independence. And you have to be independent. It's only then that you're not dominated. And here then also a sense in the Calvinist tradition that land, and not just Calvinists obviously, but land is special. Why? Because it's owned by God. There's something of religious significance about land. Also then there's another aspect here, which is that human beings are not then meant to consider ourselves absolute owners of land, even if we happen to be landowners. I'll get back to that in a moment. But you might own land, but you can't consider yourself an absolute owner because God is the only one with absolute ownership, with the only one with absolute dominion. Also, then remember in Paul 1 Corinthians, it's meant to be a non-proprietary view of the body, that we don't really even own ourselves as such, right? Our life is not ours to just own. Again, you can see why that's why that's going to appeal to a classical Republican association, because it denies complete arbitrary freedom of the will. Right, your life, your sensibilities, your responsibilities, it's not just here for you to do anything with. Life is a gift and a task, responsibility, rather than just absolute freedom. And that comes through here by a non-proprietary view, which is, again, I mentioned Locke as foregrounding liberalism. Why is that? Well, the great moment in Locke is where he decides that you own your own body, and therefore you own your own labour and have your own rights, and so on. I'll come back to that in a moment. But so there's a sort of differences here in the way you place the emphasis for Calvinists and classical Republican, which map onto each other. Now, both of those 2 points about sort of God owns the land and you don't own the land already yourself can go in at least 3 different ways, right? It seems to me when it comes to some Christian ethics of ownership as such, and especially when it comes to ownership of land. One, of course, is just to deny ownership as a good at all. Right, that it's any form of ownership is problematic. And Gerard Winstanley, some of you may have come across as the Diggers, this great movement during the English Civil War. Winstanley very disappointed by the way that Cromwell behaved after his success and so on with this point, because of course Cromwell starts to suppress these radical Puritan groups himself. But there's a view that all land has to be held in common, right? It's owned by God. No individual can own it. It's only in common. So that'd be one way of pushing these views of land there. Another way is actually just to be indifferent to ownership. Right, so much less progressive. Take a very, I mentioned Paul's soma right there, the image of the body. Remember Paul's point that, You might be on the bottom of society. You're the feet. You're the slave rather than the king at the head. But you're all just part of the body. It doesn't matter. Don't be so concerned about your status within society. Who cares about society? The world is going to end anyway. So don't worry about it. If you're obsessed with your status, you're not a true Christian. Something Luther repeats, of course, in the 1525, is it? I think after 1520, he gives his the freedom of a Christian. All Christians are free, and of course that sparks off the peasants' revolt. So we can overthrow feudal system, and Luther then writes, no, that supports the violent suppression of the murderous horde of peasants, as he calls them, right? Because Christians shouldn't be disrupting society in this way. It comes from Luther's view of mandates, right? Civil society just exists to keep peace. So again, you prop up civil society by playing part in it. You don't have to be so concerned with your status, which for him is, of course, freeing. Then there's this other one that I'm more interested in, though, which seems to come through. And got the Erskines and Thomas Boston, Ralph and Ebenezer Erskine. They're the succeeders, lead to this break with the Kirk in the 1730s. John Willison, another writer, and John Witherspoon, who I'll come back to in a moment. There are differences between them theologically, but they're all united in this opposition to patronage, to the landowner choosing the vicar, and in their opposition to what becomes called moderatism. And what they start to do is something different from those other two positions I've outlined, which is really to start to emphasize ownership rights, land ownership rights, much more even heavier like that classical Republican tradition. And why they're doing that? Well, because they think that they start to realize that an emphasis upon ownership rather than indifference to ownership or just everything in common, that actually is the best way of preventing the common people from being dominated by the laird and the local landlord. So try and fill that out a little bit here. So you've seen, I'm sure you've no doubt all come across this. There's this great movement towards stewardship language, of course, right? So the green agenda more broadly, but certainly within theological ethics, right? Environmental ethics, a focus on stewardship language, and so a dislike really of that genesis or dominion, right? Human beings given dominion over the earth. That there's something really problematic about that language. Well, actually, there's nothing really that problematic about the term dominion, right, in itself, if it's understood in this context, right? Because the point is that dominion doesn't mean domination. That's the crucial difference. It's a misreading of the language of dominion to think of it in terms of domination. That would be that arbitrary freedom that human beings can do whatever they want with themselves and do whatever they want with the earth. That's not actually what's meant by the language of dominion. It's actually that dominion doesn't entail domination, and actually to have that sense of ownership is a preservative against domination in its negative sense. So what you see, particularly in Scottish context, I mean, if any of you have ever bought property in Scotland, I bought a flat when I got my job up in St Andrews, and I became a fewer, all this sort of stuff. I got my lease, right? Remember, I think it's just the year 2000 that Scottish gets rid of feudal ownership, feudal system. It's in England, it goes in the 17th century, but your leases and everything else are still written in this language of vassals and stewards and feudhold and everything else. And this really comes to the human dominion, the dominion we're given in this Calvinist, the ownership we've got is one as stewards, right, as few holders, as vassals to God. Right? God is the absolute owner, the absolute ruler. We're stewards and vassals. That's what our dominion is. And again, I've mentioned Leviticus 25, the Jubilee. Okay, it can't be sold permanently. The land is God's. We're foreigners and strangers in it. So why are we allowed some possession of it? Well, it's to do something with and for the land and for ourselves with it, right? Some sort of sense of redemption through the land, through working the land, through this type of ownership or temporary ownership. And so you see this language with God, right? That God has dominion. He's got dominion of the land. He's the landlord, right? Not so we sojourn in as guests. We're tenants, right? Tenants. God has the freehold. So all this sort of language, this landlord, ownership, trusts, trustees, all of this language comes through for Calvin, and really comes through for all these Scottish Calvinists in the 18th century, Orthodox Calvinists, as they're developing their sort of position on ownership. And so here, then, what they realise, or what they continue to develop, is that dominion, some sense of ownership, is important for the common people, to use their term, because actually it foregrounds stewardship as part and vocation as part of stewardship. And then what it emphasizes there is that if you happen to own land, you have a certain vocation to use it in a certain way. So not just for your own benefit, not just for your own consumption. Your vocation as a landowner is to provide for your laborers, your dependents, but as stewards to God. And similarly, then the idea, well, land, what's the role of land workers? So, I mean, it's still in that mandate vocational language, right, that comes out of the Reformed tradition, out of Luther. Well, workers still have a responsibility. It's not to just overthrow everything. They've got vocation to work, but they're not meant to be dominated in their work, right? They're meant to be paid properly or whatever else and this sort of thing. And they're doing it as God's stewards. So what happens then is that it's not that owning land is in itself intrinsically problematic. It's not bad to be a landowner, right? The opposite is the case, in fact. That'd be one tradition come out of here, like the Winstonian, no, can't be landowners. That's an evil to own. It's not here. It's that actually that it's not the ownership as such. It's the way that land ownership is being disordered and sort of perverted because their dominion is becoming domination. Right, and when as soon as dominion starts to become domination, then it prevents land ownership and work being vocational for either the land owners or the land workers. Right, that's part of the claim here. So you can see how then this hopefully you can see how this starts to become important with this debate about patronage, the Patronage Act in particular, this act that's passed in the 18th century and becomes increasingly important through 1730s, 1750s, because what they're saying is that the moderate party, these people who are meant to be these great Scottish Calvinist ministers, are really just supporting the domination of ordinary people in both their physical and their spiritual lives. The church is no longer theirs, it's the aristocrats, because it's the landowners that get to choose who your vicar is. And then also they're being dominated in their physical lives because they're not being properly paid or compensated for their work. Okay, so it's this form of domination. And so then what's happening is that Labour fails in their vocation, right, because they're becoming a slave to the landowner. The landowner, in dominating them, is replacing God, right? They're not steward. They are making themselves they often talk in these tracts about the absolute landlords. These are playing absolute landlords, whereas God is the absolute landlord. And that's going to hear that they own the land, it's theirs, the work is theirs, and everything, all the benefit is meant to accrue to them. That's the thing. And of course, where that then prevents land work being vocational for the ordinary people, because it can't be done for stewardships for God properly. It's only being done as a slave, to use the key classical Republican language. Because as soon as you're being dominated by someone else and you're not independent, then you're a slave. Remember that absolute dichotomy. It's either a slave or free. You can see how that Republican language comes into American tradition there. But also the landowner is being dominated, right? So their dominion, their sort of what should have been their ownership of land for a purpose of redemptive purpose, is preventing that. It's being disordered because they're allowing themselves to be dominated by their pursuit of greed and luxury. Luxury, a key motif for classical Republicans, that as soon as an individual starts to pursue luxury as their end, then they become a slave to their passions and are no longer in control. And as soon as then a society starts to pursue luxury, wealth, then it becomes disordered because it becomes enslaved to the passions of just a few landowners. That's the criticism here. So the claim I'm making then is that the classical Republicans are anti-concentrated ownership. They're anti-concentrated ownership because you have to have diverse land holdings to ensure the independence of people within society for themselves, so they have independent freedom, and then also as a good to society itself. So society is not just taken down the route of being led by just a few individuals, but can actually pursue the public good of a diverse landholding. That seems to also, this is what then happens in the 18th century for these Calvinists, where they're also anti-concentrated ownership, anti the patron, anti the landlord, anti their ownership rights and their rights in the church. And so they want to have diverse ownership as well, to break apart concentrated ownership. And for them, because it's a guarantor of vocation. Right, so ownership becomes a way of diverse ownership, becomes a means of guaranteeing stewardship for everyone. Everyone is then able to be a steward, and so it's really dominion for non-domination. That's the claim that I'm trying to make here. That we don't have to abandon all of our theological, ethical, political language to even achieve the goal of sort of stewardship or diverse ownership, because actually the language of dominion is quite important for that historically, certainly. So here, I've got some time left. So let's give you a sort of summary view of what I'm trying to get at here. So the claim is that for popular Calvinists, and that's what they are, they're popular, right? The popular party, the popular vote, the common people, and they're using these classical Republican strands. And it's because what their argument is that the church and state, both church and the states, are disordered when power becomes concentrated in a landed oligarchical elite. That's a problem. And it's the criticism of the moderates, there's other wing within the Scottish church, is that they're just turning themselves into gentlemen. They're siding with the laird, with the powers of the landowners over ordinary people, because they just want to have a power grasp themselves. And in doing that, they've obviously given up on Presbyterianism. They've given up on the Kirk. The Kirk is being destroyed. I mean, that's really the view that's put forward there. So concentrated ownership is problematic for these popular Calvinists. So, but the response to that, as I've been saying, the response is not to devalue ownership, which would have been one route, right? But actually to oppose the concentrated ownership of land and therefore power. So support that diversification. And it's because diverse land ownership is the guarantor of spiritual and physical independence, agency, vocation. All that language comes together, right? So why should the common people have to have their own land? Why is that more important? Because now that if they have a land, then the church can't be taken from them. If they have land, then their labor can't be taken from them, and therefore their stewardship can't be taken from them, right? Their ability to live this redemptive life through these sort of tasks. I mean, we get into different types of covenants with some of the language I've used there, but I don't want to go into that as well. It'll be here even longer. Put a picture of John Witherspoon. Now, Witherspoon, some of you may have heard of Witherspoon. Certainly in America, would have heard of him, only Americans here. Witherspoon is the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence. And he is actually the leader of the Orthodox party in Scotland. So he's a Scottish Calvinist minister who is invited over to America by what becomes Princeton University. And he becomes president of Princeton, replacing Jonathan Edwards as president. And so really, I mean, just extraordinarily interesting figure in sort of American political context anyway. He writes what's widely regarded really as the first moral philosophy textbook. It's called Lectures on Moral Philosophy. He didn't actually write it as a book. It's taken put together from his lectures, and it's important for lots of reasons. He's a common sense philosophy comes out of it. He's a supporter of the revolution, obviously. He teaches Madison and others. So really interesting, important political figure. Now, the way that Witherspoon is read in the way that I've written against a few times and counting. So Witherspoon, the idea is that Witherspoon goes to America and ceases to be an Orthodox conservative Calvinist, right? Because again, the view is, well, those conservative Calvinists in Scotland, they're anti-enlightenment, anti-reason, anti-education, anti the common good, all this sort of stuff. And so if he must become a radical, right? Becomes as an Enlightenment figure if he then signs the Declaration of Independence. Now, of course, none of that's true. The signing of the Declaration of Independence is completely consistent with that popular Calvinism, right? With classical republicanism. I mean, Witherspoon's classical republicanism in the Scottish debates, as he's opposing the Patronage Act, is consistent with his republicanism in that broad American sense when he goes over and signs the Declaration of Independence. Now, what Witherspoon also does, really interestingly, and this is part of some other research of mine which is still ongoing. But you see, here I've got a picture here of the Hector, this ship, the Hector, in Nova Scotia. Right, what is new? Nova Scotia is New Scotland, and Witherspoon is the owner of the Hector. So he becomes a land agent, and he's selling, puts his advertising in local newspapers throughout Scotland. So he's selling land to the ordinary people to get them to come over to North America, where they can have their freedom and their independence based on their own land holdings in Canada, which again leads to Witherspoon being criticised in his Scotland of his day for taking the best out of Scotland. But you can see how that then comes up with the clearances and so on later on. So yeah, so Witherspoon, interesting figure, but again, to my mind, helps to support my my thesis, right? Because it's not only classical republicanism as it goes to America, but also wants to sell land. It becomes crucially important for a popular Calvinist to sell land to ordinary people to guarantee them their agency, their vocation, and their independence through ownership. And that's this is the harbour where it landed in Nova Scotia. I think I'm almost certain, but or hedge the bets there. But the boat, I take it, is a mock-up that you can go and visit. But anyway, so I'm going to try now to get through the time I've got left, which is a little while. I want to get to the other side of the debate and the Scottish Land Commission. So I'll just drift through probably these next two slides and maybe come back to them if I've got time. But you can see that, probably just to flag this up, that again, if you're going to say in classical Republican terms, it's great to own land, it makes you virtuous, gives you independence. Virtuous in the sense it gives you the opportunity to follow the law of reason, to develop self-command. And that's what virtues are. Remember, virtues are habits, literally habits of character that allow you to accomplish ends. That's what virtue is. So the idea is land ownership is an opportunity to make yourself virtuous. Then why isn't loaning lots of land really virtuous, right? Why does it make you really virtuous person? And again, that's classical Republican concern with any forms of concentrated power, any form of an elite is an anathema for classical Republican, however those elites are formed. And here it is through land holding, right, because that's giving you rights of patronage and so on. And the idea is because, if you amass more and more land for yourself and you start to dominate, that land dominates society, then you become more insular, right? You become an elite is an insulated group, which then pursues only its own interests. And so to own, the more and more land you own, is necessarily disordering. That's the claim. So sort of drift over that, but I've made those points a little bit. Also, this is a slightly sort of larger point, and I'll drop this in maybe as I go forward, and can always come back to it. What time when it comes into questions? This is another sort of missing aspect to this in both the sort of scholarship as well as the sort of talk, I guess, as well. But what you've got see this line here. This is from uh, one of the works by a guy called Walker, pushing for the excommunication of Hume and a guy called Lord Kames, that the moderates are Shaftesburyan gentlemen, not Calvinist ministers, and that's not unique to him. That's absolutely everywhere here. So I mean, I can't really go into this now. I don't think it's not really time, and it would maybe only be of interest to me. But what's going on here, as I foreground a little bit at the beginning, is that it's the Orthodox Calvinists, these conservative, right, in inverted commas, anti-enlightened figures, who are the people who believe in the powers of natural reason. And why are they doing that increasingly? Drawing on Calvin, but also Cicero and a guy called Samuel Clarke, who's Isaac Newton's bulldog, the great defender of Newtonianism in the 18th century. Why are they doing that? Well, because the moderates are developing sentimentalism. And sentimentalism is this sort of philosophy, moral philosophy, that grows out of Lord Shaftesbury's work in particular, a guy called Francis Hutcheson, David Hume, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson. They're all different versions of sentimentalist. In other words, the view being that human reason doesn't have metaphysical or religious content itself. The view here is that reason is just calculation, just adding things up. The real drivers to religious life, to moral life, political life, are our sentiments, our affections. They're what drive us. And of course, the Calvinists are rationalists. They don't like this push into the passivity, fallenness of our emotional lives, rather reason as something that is itself divine in that way. And so a lot of this classical Republican language really develops in the opposition to sensitive philosophy, which is sentimentalism. That you can tell that they're aristocrats, you can tell that they're obsessed just with themselves and their own passions and their indulgences, their luxury, because all they do is worship the laird, they worship Lord Shaftesbury, and they want to make everything beautiful and refined and prevent the ordinary people of Scotland having any moral or religious agency because they don't have the right education. That's the criticism. So part of the criticism is that I mean, Shaftesbury, obviously earlier Englishman, but it's mainly Francis Hutcheson, who's an Irishman, but becomes a leading figure in university system of Scotland and so on. It's that this view of the moral sense rather than conscience, right? Reason rather than sentiment. Hutcheson translates Marcus Aurelius, and so the idea is that the moderates want you to read the classics rather than to read the Bible. So the idea being then that for the Orthodox is that they are changing literally changing the religious and moral landscape of Scotland by changing the language in which it's described. And so as soon as you take away basic biblical language or traditional language of reason and vocation, as soon as you remove that, then the ordinary people can't even access the debates that are going on in all this literature. So that comes through a lot in this rhetoric. Might be able to drop back a little bit if I can a bit. So probably not. I should have got not quite as long as I set myself for. But anyway, Scottish Land Commission. So yeah, I mean, it seems to me, and it's not just the Scottish Land Commission. You can pick out discussions now of land or other documents. Certainly, there's these classical Republican, popular Calvinist themes in discussion of land in Scotland, because this idea that there's something unique about land itself, and therefore something special morally and politically about ownership, why ownership is so significant, an intrinsic good, not for what it leads to its consequences necessarily, not so just have the ownership itself is something important because of what land is. And so you see, the land is at the heart of Scotland's identity. Right, so again, that different sort of language, right, gential, rather than just a resource. Right, so the relationship between land and the people of Scotland is fundamental, and it's the structure of land ownership defining factor in that relationship. So again, yeah, why is ownership such a significant issue? Well, because again, the popular Calvinist classical Republicans concentrated ownership is in itself problematic because there's something wrong with that sort of model for ownership. It disorders and disintegrates both the people owning the land, but also the people working and living on this land that is owned by other people. So that's right. So not just good management, but ownership, right? It's concentration of power. That's the problem with having concentrated land ownership. It's concentrating power. It's concentrating the power in an elite, and they govern for themselves. So concentration is hampering development and well-being there. So what's concentration? What's the problem there here? Is it takes us back to this language of domination, right? That's what's the problem. The land is being dominated. If the land is owned by just a few people, then it starts to be dominated by those people in a way which is unhealthy for the land, for the owners, as well as the people living on it, right? The harmful effects, derelict land, right? Trophy estates, poorer health outcomes, pollution, right? That's probably a different end from a straightforward financial one. Disenchantment, right, disenfranchising, unequal access, right, just even accessing the land, feeling of helplessness, and so on by a dominant a landlord. So there's always this language of power, right, lack of diversity, ecological diversity, as well as cultural diversity. So all of this stuff that the popular Calvinists were trying to get at, right, the concentration of land and concentration of power was disordering Scot-Land spiritually as well as physically. That sort of is repeated there. Okay, so that's a sort of very quick gloss of some of the Scottish land stuff, but I hope it gives you that sense of these themes emerging out of it. So let's just try and do the other side as well, and then come back to some concluding remarks. So that's the classical Republican side, right? That there's something special about land, that there's something intrinsically wrong with concentrated ownership, so that needs to be broken apart. And in breaking it apart is what leads to spiritual and physical flourishing of Scotland and the Scottish people. That's really that language that you find historically as well as in contemporary language. Now, the other side to it are the moderate literati. As I mentioned, right, these are sort of really famous philosophers, and there are many sort of philosophers in that sense. But remember that they're also almost every single one of them also clergymen as well, and they represent the opposing half of this debate in the 18th century. But it's also the case that their language reappears in Scottish Land Commission documents and in the contemporary debate. That's the claim. So there's a conflict there, it seems to me, and the conflict is perhaps inevitable for the reasons that we'll see in just a moment. Well, the reasons that I'll mention now. One of them is that I've just mentioned a lot about how the popular Calvinists are classical Republicans. Classical Republicanism is also called civic humanism. The leading classical Republican civic humanist of this era is Lord Shaftesbury. So it's not a hard and sharp divide, right? Sort of moderates and popular Orthodox are taking opposing side in this debate over the Patronage Act, but they're not using completely different or completely different language always to describe their own opposing positions, if that makes sense, because it's all Republican in a sense. What I mean by that is that as we'll see in a moment, that the moderates also want to break apart monopoly power, break apart an elite, but they think they don't care about concentrated ownership of land as a means to do that. They think that it's backward looking and retrograde and itself a form of elitism to be so obsessed with owning land when the best way of having a free modern society is focusing on money, mobile property. The classical Republican obsession, the popular party obsession with ownership is unmodern. It's getting in the way of progress. Right? That's the thing. So mobile property rather than physical property. So that's really the switch. And a lot of it, again, I haven't got time to unpack a lot of this stuff, but just in case any of you interested in this sort of thing, a lot of it again, it mentions Shaftesbury and sentimentalism, also Lockean liberalism. I'll get through that in a moment. A lot of it's how it combines the moderates in what's called Addisonian politeness, and this is Addison's and Steele's Spectator their great sort of paper magazine that was published. What was the aim of the Spectator, remember, was to educate the masses, was to bring philosophy and learning out of the libraries and onto the tea tables. That's the way Addison and I think I've got that on the next slide. But again, so you can see the idea. What we mean by liberal, liberalizing, progressive, is a focus here actually on the idea. Well, you're worth just as much as the aristocrat. Just because the aristocrat owns land, who cares? They're actually worth less than you if you know more than them and if you earn more than them. So that's the switch they want to make. So let's hear. So how has that happened through Locke, and why Locke is significant here for these figures? And I mentioned this propriety. I'm going to go over the 50 minutes, I think, but I'll just go through that a bit. But is the propriety of the own yourself, right? So this is the Glorious Revolution, right? 1688. This is Locke's politics become really important here. You get rid of the king, right? Getting rid of James II, getting William and Mary. What is Locke is literally opposing patriarchy because he's writing against Robert Filmer's Patriarcha, which insists that only the king has rights, the divine right of kings. Whereas Locke's point is that everyone in society has rights, and that everyone has rights because we all own our own body. We own ourselves. And because we own ourselves, we therefore own our labor. So here Locke's thing is, if you work the land and no one else is making the claim for it, it becomes yours. It becomes your land through work. And if you're not going to be allowed to own the land, you have to be paid for working on the land and paid properly for it because you own your body and you own your labor. So again, that's why this what anachronicity called liberalism. But that's why it's this liberal rights tradition and so on that coming out of Locke, that everyone has a right, natural rights tradition, and everything else. There we go. So you see here, this is Locke's famous example I put on the slide here of his imagined Native American king, right, who has all this land but is worth less than a day labor in England. And why is he worth less? Because his land makes no money. Who cares if you own all this land? It's not of interest. So what you can hopefully see here a little bit is that a strict Lockean liberal tradition is also going to oppose trophy estates in the same way as a classical republican way, but in slightly different terms. The Lockean way is going to oppose trophy estates because land shouldn't be lying fallow. It should be making money. Whereas the Republican one's going to oppose because of that concentration of power. Okay. So you see here, he approaches land to himself by his labor, right? Well, you're getting the land right. Enclosure engrossment becomes really insignificant for the clearances later on, right? This is what the clearances are, engrossing, closing land. Why is that acceptable under this language, as it was for some of these Enlightenment figures, on Scottish Enlightenment figures, literati? Why is it acceptable? Because the land should be made productive. The land should be made to work to make money out of it, because then the whole of society benefits from that financial end. So that's why it's, you work the land, don't leave it in common, it's worse to be lying waste and so on. So that's that. So again, but you see the point with this, where I put it, unlanded gentry. The idea here is that the landowner is on a level with owners of mobile property, which is money. Steele brings it out really nicely in this quotation here, right? The economy of the merchant and the conduct of the gentleman must be the same, unless by scorning to be the steward, he resolves the steward should be the gentleman. A real idea here that aristocrats, the people that own the land, are worth less than the merchants and the workers who make money from the land. And it's actually the landed gentry who are dependent upon everyone else. It's a real switch in the whole ethos, right, of a sense of status in society. You don't have the status just because you own land. It's whether the land's been made to work, and if you have mobile property in the forms of money coming out of it. Also, then now. It is, of course, the case with this idea of luxury. That's definitely the case, right? Sentimentalist that comes through. The sentimental for the moderate literati. They are sentimentalists. It is about passions, and they would accept that, and they do emphasize self-interest, right? That your passions are given over. The pursuit of luxury for the Calvinists, for the classical Republicans, is an intrinsic evil. To pursue luxury is a bad thing. You disorder yourself. You've enslaved yourself to your own passions. You slave your society to the pursuit of money, pleasure. These are not good things. So that is the case. They do, of course, this is the law of unintended consequences, right? Law of unintended consequences, most famously in Adam Smith's Invisible Hand. Right? A phrase he only uses once, I think, in Wealth of Nations, then another time in an essay on science. But obviously, it takes over everything because it's sort of invisible hand. It's unintended consequences. Now, what we should remember here, though, I'll just briefly touch on this, that even though these moderates have that sort of language about sort of self-interest and luxury, two things here. One is that they don't think that pursuit of luxury serves just the elite. They think it enriches the whole of society. And so Francis Hutcheson, who I mentioned earlier, is the first man to coin the phrase "the greatest happiness to the greatest numbers," which of course becomes the utilitarian motif through John Stuart Mill and Bentham a bit earlier. So actually, they think that wealth is for the benefit of all. They certainly are not emphasising the pursuit of luxury to benefit a few, the patrons, this sort of stuff. That's not their point of view. They think that it actually can spread wealth. Also, in that we should have to remember, and lots of there are other people writing about this as well on these things, is that they are the theological conservatives. This view that we have of these Enlightenment figures, right, anti-religion, or they're anti those conservative Calvinists, those Orthodox people like John Witherspoon and everything else. Well, actually, they're the ones who are determinists. And there's this guy, Lord Kames, I mentioned, who they tried to prosecute for and to excommunicate. They're doing that because he denies free will, and he says he denies free will because that's what Calvin would do as well. That we are all just guided by, as Smith's phrase, the invisible hand of God. And so actually giving ourselves over to our passions and following our guidance is to follow the hand and guidance of our Maker. So it's definitely a form of its own form of theological conservatism. Also, as I've already hinted at, they're criticised for getting into this point about that they're Shaftesburyan gentlemen, they're not really ministers, they're not true Calvinists, they're just on the side of the aristocrat. They just have polite education, polite manners, refinement, beauty. They've left behind the rustic souls. Well, here, as I alluded to by mentioning Addison before, for Hutcheson and others, this is the great, and for Knox, of course, go back to John Knox. This is the foundational principle of Presbyterianism, which is mass education, right? Growth in education, that education, the pursuit of learning, is not something that should just be kept for the nobleman. It's something that's possible for everyone. And so, to actually, the view of the moderate literati is that they can ennoble everyone through polite education, the same way that Addison and Smith did through their spectators. So it is really a Presbyterian emphasis upon the value of education. Of course, the Scots had, English had their two universities at the time, and the Scots had their, what was it, four or five? I should obviously know that working for one of them. But anyway, they had their five, maybe ancient universities. And Smith, as John Buchan later on, a great tradition of going to Glasgow University and then going to Balliol mainly to do a year or two. And all the Scots that do it in the 18th century just are deplored by how awful Oxford is as an educational institution. Everyone just messing around, not doing any work, not learning anything. Anyway, so I'm coming up against time, so I'll just mention a few points. I won't go over the hour. So what I've been trying to get at here, where do we see this other commercial language coming through? So this commercial language comes through in conversations about land in Scotland, land ownership, land rights, and so on. It's that the land must do something. So it's not just that sort of intrinsic good of ownership. It's about its purposefulness. That in Locke's term, it can't lie fallow. And why can't it lie fallow? Because it should be making money, right? It's for the Scottish economy, right? It's about its productivity. So again, it's land. Is it really just that classical Republican special category, or is it actually, because in the liberal tradition, land is just another form of property? It's because it's equivalent to mobile property, money. It's just another form of property. What matters is its value and the money it makes, not just having it itself. And that comes through here. I mean, what I've tried to pick out here is, conversations of breaking apart the monopoly of concentrated ownership are put in terms, very much in economic terms, right? It's got to modernize land ownership. Why is it monetized? Well, it should match other land markets, right? Financial markets. It's hampering economic development. Okay, concentrating power, but that's creating dysfunctional rural land markets. There's a lot of emphasis on the economic disadvantages of concentrated ownership here, that's a more commercial Republican theme again, right? In that sense, perhaps. At least it's certainly focused on the fact that things should be making money and the money should be spread around. Or maybe it's just straightforward capitalist rather than even a commercial republicanism. So yeah, patterns of land market, and again, so why should Scottish land be different owned? Well, it should be normal like other countries, but also other economic sectors. So again, using that as a model for land. Okay, so here I'm going to end here. So this is it. And it is the last slide. So I did make it to the end successfully, just about. Gone back to the quotation I started with. I've added onto it one that was either from today or yesterday, sorry, yesterday or the day before, current Rural Affairs Secretary talking about this land bill that's progressing at the moment, getting to its final stage. So it's really just interested in this language, right? This language picked up, okay, fundamental resource, okay, resource. What's that? Financial resource, but then also measure of inequality. Okay, so it's inequality, but inequality of what? Of the ownership itself or of the money that's coming out of the land? And then there was always this language of modernization, modern, right? Modern democracy needs explanation. And then again, see the other day, right? It's owned and managed, but it shouldn't be owned and managed it should be for the benefit of all. I mean, it's quite a claim, right? That land must benefit absolutely everyone. I mean, how does that happen to ownership? Should everyone be owning all the land? I mean, it's quite difficult. So where does this get us with this language of modern? Why is that interest? Well, again, as I mentioned with the literati, well, what makes a modern democracy when it's created through Locke, and actually there's echoes of parliamentary sovereignty in John Knox earlier as well. And then through the language of covenant, right? Covenant with the people. The people. That's why he's always telling off Mary Queen of Scots, Knox in their meetings together. Well, what makes it modern is that your enfranchisement, your political agency, is not based on the fact that you own land. That's what makes it modern. So in a way that it's not modernizing, you could arguably, right, to say we need to go back to an idea of owning land to be agents. And that's not to say we shouldn't do it, but that's going to be classical Republican rather than modern, depending on what you mean by the word modern here. So there's the idea of like fundamental resource, modern democracy, dynamic economy, all this language. Well, okay, if that's the focus, economy, economics, finance, that is the language that was used to justify the clearances, engrossment and closure. That was what used to justify concentrated ownership in the first place, because the idea was actually, well, it was an indifference who owned the land, and concentrated ownership had some value in making the land more productive because it ensured that it wasn't lying fallow and not being used. Also, then this idea when we're talking about ownership. Okay, so we're thinking about what's our image here coming out. I think coming out of things like the clearances, the 18th century, overshadows a lot of these discussions. We're thinking about the laird in his tweeds, right, sort of walking across his land with a giant stick or something. But here we've got is publicly owned land any more modern or accessible? What about land that's owned by these large corporations? I mean, if you think about land as managed for the public good by the council, I mean, the publicly owned land, you can't park on, wouldn't be able to park on lots of streets for free, right? You have the right to do that. So it's owned by someone, but managed by someone else for our good. So, I mean, what would antagonize the classical Republican as much as the commercial Republican is the idea of any sort of governmental elite, let alone sort of individual elite, taking land away from your own sort of accessibility and agency. So, anyway, raises lots of questions, not meant to solve any questions there, obviously to raise that language and just this interest here, why I think theology is a particularly important route into this question, both historically and contemporary, is because of this fact that theology, Scottish theology in Scotland really hints at this fundamental connection between physical landscape and what was called the moral landscape, right? Moral landscape, that physical and moral landscape are somehow connected, and so the ways in which what Scotland values about its future, right, ethically, monetarily, culturally, politically, all those things seem to be and always have been inseparable from not only just the value it places on land and the value it places on owning land, but also the values and virtues it derives from having and owning and working on Scotland itself. So that's it for me, and that was an hour. I probably should have said that rather than 50 minutes. Many thanks. I'll take down the PowerPoint.
That's great. Thank you so much, David. That was
My pleasure.
jam-packed lecture, jumping from philosophy to Church of Scotland politics to Parliament to land and how it relates to identity and people. It was great. Thank you.
Good.
So we do have some time for some questions. The chat is open if anyone feels moved to ask anything. I do have a question. Maybe it's a bit of a simple question, but I know the Church of England is one of the biggest landowners in the UK, and I'm wondering how much land did the Church of Scotland own, and how did that kind of fall into these conversations? Because when you were talking about land ownership, it was very talking about individuals and individual as kind of having dominion. But what about the Kirk? Can the Kirk be a trusted dominion of land?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, and you're right. So both churches do own a lot of land, and Church of England is increasing its land holding. It seems so. It's also growth in it because of this land as an investment. That and it's interesting. consequence of this of the green economy and stuff there as well. What it's actually increased the value of owning land. And you're right. That's I mean that was part of what I was trying to get at the end there, whether we talk about institutions owning land or communities owning land, is that any better than an individual owning land? I mean, there's that great remark of G.K. Chesterton where he says that it's something, I mean, it's something better than this, but it's something like a man who, I'm not endorsing this, but just repeat it, but so a man who pushes over his butler is at least a Democrat, right? Because if he gets in an argument with it, at least he's treating his butler as a human being. He's so enraged by it. And there's something about that with individual landowners, right? That you can go and berate the individual, like the traditional laird can go and be berated, right? But actually access, whereas the institutions, it disappears. Yeah, Church of Scotland does own land, and of course, there's another project. So it's both St Andrew's Divinity School projects. Mine's owning Scot-Land. Another one is called Sacred Landscapes, and Sacred Landscapes is a bit more advanced than owning Scot-Land, which is a newer one. So it does have a great website that you can look at, which is beautifully done, and that's about the way that the Church of Scotland is selling off a lot of its land, right? So it's closing churches and divesting itself of huge amounts of land to save money, make money, whatever the claim is, and so. Yeah, I don't know how much land they own, or how much they're planning on selling. I mean, it is staggering to them. You can, I was looking at this just the other day. You can go to their website. I mean, it's depressing, really. But you can go to their website. Just go to the Church of Scotland website, and you can find the section of their website, which is their estate agent section, and look at the massive churches available for you to buy. You can buy these extraordinary. I mean, some of them. There was one in Dundee for sale, which is like sort of cathedral, or maybe it's Aberdeen, but anyway, it's extraordinary thing. So yeah, are they being good, patrons, right? I mean, that's part of the idea, isn't it? I mean, if there's something about being a steward, there's some responsibility of being an owner, then what is the route to divesting yourself of that responsibility as well as the land that comes with it? Is it something you can just divest yourself of? And what are the consequences of doing that? So, yeah, I don't think that really answers your question at all, but it does. It does. But no, I mean, it's a fascinating question and a really important point. And I'd be interested to see what happens with these churches. You know, with a change of use or become. I mean, they'll become houses, presumably a lot of them, and a lot of them are really quite expensive. So maybe great homes for the elite themselves, right? So the Kirk selling off its churches back to the laird, maybe back to the patron, so the patron can re-emerge at this point. But no, in the 18th century, I don't know. I mean, that's a really interesting question. I will look into that actually because I don't know the answer to that, and I obviously should. In fact, it's never crossed my mind to think about that. So thanks for that as a question. What the Church of Scotland, the Kirk itself, in the 18th century, whether it had its own land holdings or not. I mean, it will have. I mean, obviously, a lot of the ones that are being sold off now would have counted as land that they owned in inverted commas because it is literally the church land. But yeah, whether the view of being what it means to be a landlord, yeah, or whether there was or charging rents and so on, what it is to be a renter. But yeah, no, I mean, and trust, all this language of trust, rent. I mean, if you look at, I mentioned the Erskines. As Ebenezer Erskine alludes to this succession, that's the succeeders in the 1730s. So they succeed from the Kirk. They break with the Church of Scotland and form their own succession church, and that is over this point about patronage, that the Patronage Act, that the landowner shouldn't be having any rights within the church. And there, the language is all very much. I've talked about this idea of owning, that common people owning land, but it's also always with that proviso of being in a wilderness, right? That very Augustinian, right? That Augustinian language, right? Pilgrimage motif, right? You're wandering through the world, you're journeying through it. A sojourner, mentioned Calvin saying that earlier, that even your dominion over land, even the church's dominion over land, is not meant to be ever viewed as absolute ownership, but for some other purpose. So, yeah, I don't know. Great. I mean, it's really interesting. Actually, it's a bit like sort of George Bernard Shaw's. What is it? Is that Major Barbara? That play of his Major Barbara about that this view that earning money, making money, is there something intrinsically evil about money? So Major Barbara discovers that the Salvation Army is getting money from the owners of the breweries when they're campaigning against it. And the point for sure, anyway, is that actually the money is what you put it to some purpose. And so, yeah, a lot of these arguments say about the church making money. What purpose is the church going to put the money to? So, again, mobile property potentially of more value than physical property if that's the money that can be put to some use.
Yeah, thank you. So Alistair, I'll invite you to unmute and ask your question. And I've got a question on the chat too from Donald, which is a very good question, even though Donald's very humble about his question.
Dafydd, as we meet in the context of the Scottish Episcopal Church, I wonder if you have any information about how many of this 0.008% of landowners founded the churches that we now worship in, gave land for them, maybe paid for the entire building of them,
Yeah.
hence their patronage.
Yeah. No, that's right. I don't have that. But it's such an important question. I mean, and that's, this, as I say, this project, as it starts and it is developing in conversation with these other disciplines around theology, is to think more along those lines really here, because it is, it's something that we do forget again with that pattern of ownership. Is it ownership or is it use? And what have the landowners been doing with their land, right? Is it something problematic with being just owning it, just having it, and then so no, I mean I can't answer the specific point about how many of these landowners are doing it, but it's nonetheless true that what certainly is true is that the people that we're talking about, say Captain Anstruther in the famous Inverkeithing case, that these are not people to feed. I think into your question, they're not sort of arbitrarily using their patronage rights when it comes to the Kirk. They're not sort of just sort of deciding to join in because that's something they're able to do and they're able to interfere with internal church politics. It's sort of something that they think of great importance. They think of coming under their responsibilities, but also being their presence and activity within the parish itself. They also view it as an activity to again use this word modernize. That part of the reason why Patronage Act is supported by, in this case, the Presbyterians, of course, but it has overshoots with the point about the Episcopal Church, is that because it needs to modernize, that a better way of having churches that can thrive, that can exist, that are founded or planted, right, to use these more modern terminology, and which have, to use the moderate literatus language, which have polite gentlemen, meaning by that this sort of an educated class of clergymen, was through their patronage. That was the idea. That's part of the reason why it's really funny to look at and interesting to look at the Orthodox Calvinists, because a lot of these figures went to the same universities with the moderates, and so a lot of their rhetoric is to align themselves more with aspects of the great Anglican tradition, really, and themselves, and to say that that's what's being lost. That they're the traditional enlightened figures with Clark and Newton and all that sort of stuff. They're just as enlightened and as educated as the moderates. But yeah, no, there's no, so I can't. Again, another question which I can't answer, but I did my best to change the question in answering it to something I could, maybe.
Share the question from the chat and then I'll come to you, Anne. So the question from the chat is, do you see any similar thought line in the language and policy of the Crofting Commission and crofting more generally, which is a distinct form of land stewardship with its own history?
Yeah, I mean, wonderful. And I can't speak to that, sadly. I will be in a year's time able to speak to that because that is a big part of the project. We have people in sustainability, but also rural development, and there be so the project that I'm running has sort of policy roundtable and a couple of workshops, and then ends in a symposium and a publication of edited volume. And yeah, crofting really, that's interesting to me, of course, as someone sort of outside, as it were, the initial any of these fault lines of discussions. In a sense, it's something I've entered into. I mean, maybe I should explain how I entered into it. I mean, it was because I appeared a few years ago, appeared on the Moral Maze talking about rights, the difference between rights and duties, and giving a civic humanist sense of duties. And because of that, the Scottish Land Commission asked me to speak at one of their conferences a few years ago to talk about difference between duty and rights, land rights ownership, but in more general terms. And it was through that that came interested in this question of ownership itself in Scotland, the concentrated ownership, and became aware of it really. But then also through that, it was amazing how it just fed so easily into my ongoing research on the Scottish Enlightenment, particularly John Witherspoon and others, and Hume and everything. But it fed so easily into it. And no, so crofting, I can see that must be a really significant. Certainly, I've heard of crofters, and it always I've seen them in these great films. I can't. What's Powell and Pressburger have some incredible film about it. I can't remember what it's called, but Leave the Last with John Laurie, leave one of the last people to leave an island, a Scottish island, as crofters or something. But it comes up a lot in the chapters, either Michael Russell writing as well, the Scottish Land Commission writing one of the articles. He's also looking at these crofts as well. But so it's something that I will learn more about through this project, but also undoubtedly have to find more about it. And it would be interesting to see if what I haven't found yet is particular discussion. Take these writers, these theologians, these all Thomas Boston and the Erskines and Witherspoon and everything, talking in these general terms. Well, not general terms. I mean, in the terms I've just say not general. It's specific theologically and philosophically and politically, but they're not always engaging with particular types of activity and particular types of ownership, which is interesting. And I think largely that's because of the tracks they're responding to and the way they're preaching. But it'd be interesting to to look more through their writing itself to see what specific examples, crofting and labouring come up there as well. So it's a great question and a really interesting line of study, which I will take on.
And I'm going to invite you to ask your question. Oh, I think you just unmuted and then remuted. Let's try again.
Right, that's it now. Thank you, Victoria. And I would like to ask a question which I'd like to ask you about the energy debate, which is happening. But I have to declare two things first, because I'm not, first of all, until very recently, I was the office manager for the Stornoway Trust, the oldest community landlord in Scotland. And also my son is an electrical engineer in the HVDC department of SSE. So you might presume, and you would be correct, that I have a particular perspective on both these matters. But what interests me as we started moving into modern time, your discussion about modern times, is how a community landlord can find itself at odds with people or with people who will talk, whereas the silent majority might have a different opinion. Because the Stornoway Trust has been very clear throughout the past 25 years that the use of wind energy and other forms of energy was a great opportunity for the relatively poor areas such as the Isle of Lewis and the whole west of the Western Isles. But you are also then treading on other people's land because you need to take that energy through to hubs such as Bewley. And there is a quite vitriolic debate, and there has been, about that. And yet I suppose my perspective would be that it's really important for culturally to enable people to stay within the Highlands and Islands, and that this is one way we can do it. And I would put, and this is very controversial, I know, I would put jobs for young people and homes for young people above the not above the environment exactly, but above landscape. And I know that there is a huge argument that went on, and some of it got very, very nasty. And I wonder how you think that fits in with what you've been saying.
No, thanks. That's a great, a great question, really, and really interesting and striking issue. And I think, I mean, hopefully, it's exactly sort of. I mean, obviously, I can't speak to the specifics of those cases, and it sounds like I should be asking you a question about the energy debate rather than the other way around. But hopefully, it's something that illustrates the point that I've been trying to get at about the way that the rhetoric, the language that's used to talk about land ownership use, it doesn't necessarily clearly divide over the issue of whether you do or do not support concentrated ownership. That there's it's you know does say the argument for, so how would we phrase the argument as you just did for windmills? Okay, so we're saying, well, it's destroying, let's say, the physical, I mean, put it in strong terms, that the physical landscape is being disrupted in some way because of its appearance is changing. And that's a problem because the land should just remain the same, and it should, be ancestral and always look a particular way. Or is it the case that jobs are the purpose of land, that the purpose of land is to make money from it, and so that actually a does an individual landowner get in the way of progress because they prevent the building of windmills, or actually are they the ones who help choosing to build the windmills? I mean, it divides. I mean, it it strikes. I mean, the sort of way that I'm interested in it, of course, as a historically minded academic, and academic anyway, you have to always hedge your bets in these things, but and not come down any clear side just in case. But no, it's an interesting thing when it comes to the issue about rewilding. Say, I mean, one thing that's struck us about, so the project that's doing now had a previous a year before under a slightly different name, which was some different money, much smaller project, just had a conference for that. And what was interesting about, again, bringing together different disciplines is that it wasn't clear, and this sort of UN research and strategy on this, to understand why people don't like rewilding. And why is it? I mean, they're saying, what's this analog good, right? It's obvious that rewilding is a great thing, and everyone should be supporting rewilding. So what's the problem with rewilding in this sort of sense? Now, of course, it makes it and you can then start to make some arguments for rewilding. Well, it's about jobs and finance and so on. You could put it into those terms, but it really, one of the problems with it seems, go back to this discourse, is to try and understand the meaning, to be as accurate and accurate as exact as you were just then. Well, actually, the point of the land is to make money from it. This will make money from it, so that's the benefit. Whereas what seems to happen with a lot of the rewilding discussion is actually it is a put in egotistical terms, right? It's what psychological hedonism is. Well, this is for your own good, your own best interest, right? By doing this, you're helping yourself and future generations survive. So when you start to put it into sort of more selfish terms, then people start to think, well, actually, I can be even more selfish than that and just say I don't really care about future generations, for example, or whatever it might be, right? So we have to try and pick the rhetoric. I mean, and again, so rewilding is, let's say, again, it's part of the debate last couple of days, is that you need to end concentrated ownership to have a sustainable development, and that gives more opportunities for rewilding and this sort of stuff. Well, even if it does, that doesn't increase the sense, people's sense that they're getting anything from or having access to the land. In fact, it might decrease it, because a community group has decided that this must stay wild, and therefore can't be accessed by certain people, or can't be used in a certain way, doesn't mean that they feel any better about that land, that not having right, not having, at this point, trying to make about ownership, accessibility, dominion, that there's some the agency, that there's something about a sense of land here, that it's not just that you own it, but that you can use it, you can think about it, you can talk about it, you can get something on it. So anything that makes a particular decision about how land is used, and by some other people on other people's behalf, can be problematic. So yeah, I mean, if the debate on the windmills is that a particular group of people who live on that land want to have a debate of how to use it, and that's being interfered with from outside, whether it's by government or by an individual landowner, then that raises agency debates. And then there's the wider debate about whether land is a resource, a property, whether to use the sort of what's often criticized the Enlightenment era is it's a use and abuse sort of idea of nature, that it's there for dominion. We can use and abuse Scottish land in particular to the creance as everything else. Whereas the point you could be making and did make is that actually use for financial gain is itself part of agency. which would be a commercial Republican point of view. Yeah. So that's again, hopefully speaks to the point you were making, and even though it doesn't necessarily get addressed the sort of broad energy debate what one should think about it, I certainly wouldn't want to be saying that, but the terminology of language that we use to describe it, we're not always, or particularly politicians, are certainly not careful about it, and they don't necessarily have in mind a clear telos. I mean, the recent as I began at the first sort of slide, this test of sustainable development is a test of a community group taking over land. So then that's not. Again, it's not an ownership problem. It's the things that we expect something particular from land use. And then you look into how they define sustainable development, and it's absolutely everything you can imagine, right? I mean, it's green economy, it's rewilding, it's jobs, it's agency, it's all every rhetorical phrase they can think of is put down onto it. So yeah, at least in the Enlightenment, these two sides are quite honest about not honesty is the wrong word, accurate, right? Have an accurate sort of sense of what they think is to be gained or not gained by their models of land ownership, which they're pushing. Whereas I think we're sort of lost a little bit in the terminology we use. I mean, and again, not least because, having these. I mean, classical Republicans I mean, the idea of having paid politicians, right? That itself would be awful, right? The pensioners and placeholders of the state, people that are ruling on your behalf, but enriching themselves whilst they're doing it, but don't worry about it. It's all for your own good. I mean, that's the end of any sense of accessibility, agency to an involvement with land debates, and it does mean that you are being dominated, right? There's these Gresham House can be dominating and accessible, but also, the local council is something that we dominating us when we can't find the. I don't know if any of you have sent any emails to your local councillors and not got a reply. I certainly have in a different council from St Andrews, I should add. But anyway, yeah. So no, it raises. Yeah, I think every debate on land in Scotland, it seems to me, raises this question about the mixing of metaphors, and to try and avoid that would help people really identify what they want and expect from land, let alone from land reform.
Pick up a little bit a phrase that really struck me, which I think theologically was coming from the Calvinists. So you put me in a hard position because usually I'm a reformed person amongst loads of Episcopals. So usually I want to stand up for the reformed point of view, but I really don't like it today. So you had one phrase there, which was this idea that God owns the land, and I find that really tricky and really problematic. I think especially with the more recent kind of eco-theology, thinking of like Sally McFaig, and kind of trying to push the thinking away from God owning land to God is the world, God being interfused in the world. And I think if you take that theological perspective, that makes that your argument on supporting dominion a lot harder, because I guess you can't, dominion in the sense is like that we've had permission to have control, but if we see God as the land, then we can't control, and then that helps arguments like rewilding, biodiversity, etc. I was quite struck with kind of the historic theology. There was no sense of just the land being good in and of itself. It was like the land is good for XY purpose, and there's always a purpose, but no sense of just God made the world and it was good
and called it good. Yeah, I mean that's a great point. I mean, I suppose I would suggest that God as landlord is a great metaphor on McFaig's own use of metaphor, right? Right. Well, I mean, because that's the point, isn't it? So you're right. So he wants to recover this idea of God as mother, but then birth to creation to the world, because then that makes us think about God's connection to the world and to nature, and so we would then respect it in a certain way as having these divine dimensions to it. Yeah, I think that, and what would she'd call a dead metaphor, right? Like a dead metaphor. So the point you're trying to make is maybe God as owner is a dead metaphor or something. I mean, I think it's probably not a dead metaphor. It'd be quite interesting to revive it, right? God as landlord, or maybe better as T.F. Powys, the great 20th century idea, right? God as farmer, God as a farmer, right? They all sort of fall into that a little bit. And a sense then, I mean, certainly certainly for these figures anyway, they thought that the language of ownership was accomplish the same end as McFague, right? That McFague wants a greater respect to land, a greater sense of living with the land, that it is good because, but why is it good? Well, it's not good because it does something for us. It's good just because it is, because God has it, God made it, and it's there. And so we find our role within it, right? Find a purpose within it as stewards and few holders, rather than thinking ourselves as having dominion over it. So, yeah, I think it's. I mean, I agree. Certainly, reviving dominion and ownership as helpful metaphors or descriptions is not fashionable, but I think it's quite helpful. I think not least to accomplish, not least to it seems to me anyway, historically anyway, they're trying to accomplish the same ends that someone like McFague has about land, but through a different conception of a different metaphor. So yeah, I don't think it has to be a dead metaphor. Of course, so far to take your view though, the fact is that you can see why it has to be carefully reconstructed through the analysis I gave, right? So because part of the point can always be actually, despite what I might say, it's not a helpful metaphor. Like, it is dead metaphor because it just can't work anymore, can't operate in the way it's not. The idea of a metaphor, right, rather than analogy, like it's a jolt, right? It takes imaginative strain. Think of God as owner. Is that so shocking? Get rid of God as father because that's not shocking anymore, right? So God as mother is more shocking. As we have to jump up into God's ineffability through useless language. But yeah, I think it can be. I think it can be shocking, hopefully jolting to imagine God as landlord. Yeah.
Guess it depends what kind of landlord you've had experience
Well,
with.
that's right. That's it. Well, that's it. But yeah, to give it, I mean, you're right. It's the idea. The idea here is that that these are evaluative terms, right? That in this context, ownership, dominion, landlord are normative terms. They're not just descriptions. They actually come with a certain sense of what they look like to really be themselves. Otherwise, they're not. You're not a landlord. You're a domineering domineering landowner. You're what Bonhoeffer would call a sicut deus man, right? Rather than imago Dei man. You're a human being trying to make themselves God. So you think that you can disorder and own the land and do what you will with it and other people, whereas you're meant to be living in this imago Dei way, which would map onto ownership in this sort of sense. So yeah, so it is. It's yeah. I mean, it's definitely. I think it's definitely easier to pursue the Jared Winstanley route, right? Like it's that you just will get rid of ownership altogether. It's not useful. It's destructive, whatever else, and this sort of thing. You can draw a closer line through that, but they are these popular Calvinists, as well as the moderates, both sets of Calvinists were taking a more complicated route, and one which is, if nothing else, interesting because of the way it keeps repeating itself. Alongside conservation, stewardship. I mean, this language of stewardship, it's inseparable in Scottish history from, and not just Scottish, from Reformed traditional, but from this idea of dominion, vassal, and so on.
We are due to finish at past, so Ashley, I'm really sorry. I don't think we're going to have time to take your question because I just wanted to finish on one from Tim, which I think is a great question to finish on, which is what Dafydd would you like us to take away as your one kind of biggest takeaway from this lecture?
So just one thing, I suppose. I mean, the one thing probably is that the Scottish Enlightenment is an era of theological debate. The Scottish Enlightenment is about theology. These are religious debates. They're not things that just be co-opted by secular philosophers and everything else. That it's important, that my work is really interested in the fact that studying history of theology, history of debates is really crucial if we're going to understand the sort of debates and discussions that we have in the contemporary world, not least just to stop ourselves repeating ourselves, and also be careful about the terminology that we use. So that would be the one thing, that the Scottish Enlightenment's a thriving era of theological debate, and it's a great place to look for sort of guidance on our current debates.
Thank you so much, Dafydd. Thank you everybody for watching. This will also be online. Alana will put this on YouTube, so for anyone who wants to watch it again maybe, or share with your friends. Remember to check out the SEI website and for the courses that we've got coming up, and if you'd like to enroll in a master's course or anything like that to further your development. please come back next year when we'll have the 11th annual lecture. Look out for our Advent series and our Lent series. Thank you ever so much for being with us. We're going to close down the Zoom room now, so I hope you have a really nice